Content warning. This episode discusses domestic violence and the murder of children. Listener discretion is advised. On the 2nd of July, 1970, a tourist standing at a lookout above Loch Ard Gorge on Victoria's rugged southwestern coastline noticed something wedged among the rocks far below. A car. Nose down, caught against the cliff face, hanging in a position that made it look as though it could slip free and vanish into the water at any moment. Cliff rescue volunteers were called in, and at first light the following morning, they made their way down to the vehicle. What they found inside would turn a routine traffic accident report into one of the most disturbing crimes in Victorian history. Under a tarpaulin in the back of that car lay the bodies of a woman and 3 children, still dressed in their pajamas, wrapped in blankets as though someone had tucked them in for the night before sending the car over the edge of a cliff 200 kilometers from home. The car belonged to a Glenroy electrician named Elmer Crawford. The woman was his wife, Theresa, 5 months pregnant with their 4th child. The children were his own, Katherine, James, and 6-year-old Karen. And Elmer Crawford himself was nowhere to be found. More than 50 years later, he still hasn't been. Part 1. A family in Glenroy. Elmer Kyle Crawford was born in Canada in 1930, though his roots trace back further still, to Derry in Northern Ireland, where his mother was from and where Elmer himself was raised by his grandparents for much of his childhood. In 1951, at the age of 22, he emigrated to Australia, eventually settling in Melbourne and building a working life for himself as an electrician. From the mid-1950s onward, he held a steady job with the Victoria Racing Club at Flemington Racecourse, respectable, secure employment that would have marked him out to anyone who knew him casually as a reliable, hard-working man. By 1970, Elmer was 40 years old, living with his wife, Theresa, and their 3 children at a modest home on Cardinal Road in Glenroy, a quiet suburb in Melbourne's north. Theresa was 35 and 5 months pregnant with what would have been the couple's 4th child. Katherine, the eldest, was 13. James was 8. Karen, the youngest, was 6. From the outside, by every account gathered afterward from neighbors and colleagues, the Crawfords looked like an entirely ordinary suburban family, the kind of household that blends into a quiet street without drawing any particular notice, good or bad. But investigators, once they began digging into the family's circumstances in the days following the discovery at Loch Ard Gorge, would uncover a very different picture underneath that ordinary surface. Family friends later described real tension between Elmer and Theresa in the lead-up to the murders, arguments centered on money and on Theresa's unexpected pregnancy. Nobody who spoke to police in the aftermath described any history of overt violence or explicit threats between the couple. What they described instead was a marriage under quiet, mounting strain, the kind of strain that, in hindsight, so many people wish they'd taken more seriously at the time. There were other threads investigators would eventually pull on too. Rumors, never fully confirmed, of extramarital affairs on Elmer's part in the period before 1970. And, perhaps most damning of all once it came to light, evidence that Elmer had been stealing goods from his employer at the Victoria Racing Club and on selling them. A pattern of quiet financial dishonesty running underneath the ordinary, dependable exterior he presented to the rest of the world. And then there was the matter of the wills. Just 2 weeks before Theresa and the children died, she and Elmer had drawn up new wills. Under the terms of that new arrangement, should anything happen to Theresa, Elmer stood to inherit a sizable estate, $3,000 in cash, the family home in Glenroy, and additional blocks of land up in Queensland. It's the kind of detail that, considered entirely on its own, might mean nothing at all. Plenty of couples update their wills around a new pregnancy, thinking practically about their growing family's future. Considered alongside everything else that was about to happen, it would come to look a great deal more calculated. Part 2. The night of July 1st, according to the reconstruction of events that Victorian investigators would eventually piece together, largely through physical evidence gathered at the family home, since no living witness ever described what actually happened that night. Theresa and the 3 children went to bed as normal on the 1st of July, 1970. What happened next was carried out with a level of cold, methodical planning that set this case apart from almost any other domestic tragedy investigators in Victoria had encountered before or since. Using his professional background as an electrician, Elmer had constructed a purpose-built device, a 15-meter length of electrical lead, fitted at one end with alligator clips. While Theresa slept, he is believed to have attached those clips directly to her ears and used the device to electrocute her. He then turned to his children. James and Katherine died from fractured skulls, consistent with blunt force trauma. Investigators believe a hammer was used, though the exact object was never definitively recovered. Karen, the youngest, was found to have died the same way her mother had, by electrocution. Neighbors living on the quiet street later told police they'd heard nothing unusual on the night of the 1st of July or in the early hours of the 2nd. No cries, no struggle, no sound at all to suggest that 4 members of one household were being systematically killed inside their own home, while the rest of the street slept undisturbed a few meters away. What Elmer did next required both physical strength and a genuinely disturbing level of premeditation. Investigators later determined that he had removed the back seat entirely from the family's Holden sedan ahead of time, creating extra space in the rear of the vehicle. Once his wife and children were dead, he wrapped each of them in blankets, still in the pajamas they'd gone to bed in, and loaded all 4 bodies into the car, arranging them carefully enough that, when the vehicle was eventually found, it initially looked to rescuers almost as though a family might simply have fallen asleep together in the back seat during a long drive. He then drove that car, carrying his entire family, roughly 200 kilometers southwest along the coast, to the dramatic limestone cliffs of Port Campbell, home to the 12 Apostles, and Loch Ard Gorge, among the most photographed and visited stretches of coastline in the entire state. And there, in the winter darkness, he pushed the car containing his wife and children over the edge of the cliff. Part 3. A staged scene. Elmer Crawford's plan, as investigators would come to understand it, depended entirely on that car being found in a state consistent with a tragic accident, or perhaps a murder-suicide carried out by Theresa herself in some kind of prenatal crisis. Anything, essentially, other than what had actually happened. It very nearly worked. When the vehicle was first spotted, caught precariously against the cliff face rather than having plunged all the way into the water below, it looked, on the surface, exactly like the kind of grim but explicable tragedy that occasionally happens on remote, winding coastal roads. It began to fall apart almost immediately once police made contact with the Crawford household back in Glenroy. Officers arrived at the Cardinal Road address at around 6 o'clock in the evening on the day the car was discovered and found no one home. Neighbors told police they hadn't seen Theresa or the children at all that day, but several of them mentioned something else, a detail that would prove critical to the entire subsequent investigation. They'd seen Elmer. He'd been standing in the home's driveway only about half an hour before police arrived, walking down to the front gate and looking around before disappearing again. It's a detail that raises more questions than it answers. Why was a man whose entire family had, by this point, already been dead for roughly 24 hours, still lingering around the family home the following evening, checking the street? Was he watching for police, weighing whether to flee or stay? Whatever was going through Elmer Crawford's mind in that moment, it was the last confirmed sighting of him that police were ever able to establish with real confidence. When investigators searched the Cardinal Roadhouse in the days that followed, What they found made abundantly clear that the deaths had occurred there, not at the gorge, and that the scene at Loch Ard Gorge had been deliberately staged. Blood-stained sheets, blood-stained mattresses, wiring components and electrical remnants, consistent with the construction of the device used to kill Theresa and Katherine. And, in one of the more quietly devastating discoveries made during that search, an unfinished letter written by Theresa in which she had been discussing her pregnancy. An ordinary, unremarkable piece of correspondence from a woman who, at the time she was writing it, had no idea how little time she had left. The Victoria Police Homicide Squad formally took over the investigation on the 3rd of July, 1970. Autopsies conducted that same day at the Melbourne morgue confirmed what the crime scene evidence had already strongly suggested. Theresa and Katherine had died from electrocution, while Katherine and James had died from blunt force trauma to the skull. Part 4. A manhunt that never ended, with the physical evidence at the family home making clear what had actually happened, and with Elmer Crawford unaccounted for since that brief, unsettling sighting in his own driveway. He quickly became the central, and effectively only, suspect in the case. A nationwide search was launched. But whatever else can be said about Elmer Crawford, the evidence of his careful, methodical planning in the lead-up to the murders, the electrocution device, the removed car seat, the staged crash site, the freshly updated will, suggested a man capable of planning his own disappearance with the same cold precision. He was never found. Weeks turned into months, months into years, and the trail on Elmer Crawford simply went cold, in a way that left Victorian police with one of the most frustrating open cases in the state's history. A crime they understood almost completely, committed by a man whose name and face were both entirely known to them, who had nonetheless managed to vanish so completely that not one confirmed sighting of him has ever been logged since that evening in his own driveway. In July of 1971, in the absence of any arrest, a Victorian coroner's inquest formally examined the case and reached its conclusion. Elmer Crawford had murdered his wife and 3 children. It's an unusual thing, in criminal justice terms, for a case to reach a formal, documented conclusion about who committed a crime, without ever proceeding to an actual criminal trial. But with no defendant to try, a coronial inquest was the only mechanism available to give the case any kind of official resolution at all. Officially, that finding has never changed. Elmer Crawford has remained, for more than half a century now, a wanted man who was never apprehended. Part 5. A long, cold trail, the Crawford family murders never fully faded from public memory in Victoria, the way so many cold cases eventually do. The scale of the crime, an entire family, including a pregnant mother, wiped out with this level of premeditated cruelty, kept it in the public consciousness for decades, resurfacing periodically whenever a new development, however small, offered the faint possibility of finally closing the case. In 2008, Victorian authorities offered a reward of $100,000 for information leading to Elmer Crawford's arrest, a substantial sum, and a clear signal that police had never truly given up on the possibility that he might still be alive somewhere, decades after the murders, having built an entirely new life under a different name. That possibility seemed, for a brief period in 2010, genuinely close to being confirmed. Victorian police, working in conjunction with the American FBI, began investigating whether an unidentified body discovered in a morgue in Texas might belong to the long-vanished Elmer Crawford, a lead significant enough to warrant international cooperation between 2 separate law enforcement agencies, decades after the original crime. It came to nothing. In August of 2010, following DNA comparison testing against a blood relative of Crawford's, police announced that the body in Texas could conclusively be ruled out as any connection to their missing suspect. Whatever hope that particular lead had generated, it evaporated as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the case exactly where it had been for the previous 4 decades, unresolved, and entirely dependent on either a definitive sighting or the eventual recovery of Elmer Crawford's remains. Part 6. A neighbor who never let go. Among the people who never stopped being pulled back to this case is a man named Greg Fogarty, someone with a genuinely unusual personal connection to the Crawford family. Fogarty had lived on the same street as the Crawfords back in 1970, a child himself at the time the murders occurred, watching from close proximity as the quiet, ordinary suburb he grew up in became, almost overnight, the site of one of the most notorious unsolved crimes in the state's history. That early, formative connection to the case would go on to shape the rest of Fogarty's professional life. He eventually joined the Victoria Police Force himself and used his position, along with a genuine lifelong fascination with what had actually happened to his childhood neighbors, to dig deeper into the case than almost anyone else outside the original investigating detectives. In 1996, he published a book, Almost Perfect, the true story of the Crawford family murders, later republished in an updated edition in 2011, drawing on police records, personal recollection, and years of his own research to reconstruct, in as much detail as the surviving evidence allows, exactly what happened inside that Glenroy house, and everything investigators have since been able to establish about the man who walked away from it. It's a detail that adds a genuinely human layer to an otherwise clinical, decades-long cold case file. A boy who grew up 2 doors down from a family that was murdered in their beds, who carried that unresolved question with him into an entire policing career, still trying, all these years later, to understand how a man so many people considered ordinary could have planned and executed something this calculated against his own family. Part 7. A man who isn't there. There's a particular, unsettling quality to this case that separates it from most other unsolved murders. Because unlike the Wanda Beach case, or so many other cold cases where the central mystery is the identity of an unknown killer, the Crawford case has never had any real mystery about who was responsible. Investigators, the coroner, and the broader public have all been in agreement, essentially since July of 1971, on exactly who killed Theresa, Katherine, James, and Karen Crawford. What makes this case endure more than half a century on is a different and in some ways more unsettling kind of unresolved question. Not who, but where. Where did a Melbourne electrician, with no known specialist skills in evasion or false identity, no international connections that investigators were ever able to establish, and a face that was splashed across newspapers and wanted bulletins for years afterward, actually go? How does a man simply cease to exist for over 50 years without a single confirmed sighting anywhere in the world? There's no shortage of theories. Some believe Crawford died relatively soon after the murders, by his own hand, or through misadventure, in some unmarked, unrecorded corner of the country, his remains never found simply because nobody has ever known precisely where to look. Others believe he built an entirely new identity for himself, possibly overseas, drawing on his trade skills as an electrician to quietly establish a new working life somewhere far from Victoria, hiding in plain sight for decades under a different name. The 2010 Texas lead demonstrated just how seriously investigators have continued to treat the second possibility, even 40 years on, and how quickly a case like this can flicker back into active pursuit the moment a plausible new lead presents itself, however it ultimately resolves. What's certain is this: Theresa Crawford was 35 years old, 5 months pregnant, sleeping in her own bed on Cardinal Road, when her husband ended her life using a device he had built with his own hands. Katherine was 13. James was 8. Karen was 6. All 3 children were killed in their sleep by the one person in the world who was supposed to protect them above anyone else, before their bodies were wrapped, loaded into the family car, and sent over a cliff 200 kilometers from home, in an attempt to make their murders look like anything other than exactly what they were. More than half a century later, Elmer Crawford has never been found, not alive, to face any court for what he did, and not dead, to finally give investigators, and whatever family members remain to carry this case's memory, some kind of definitive end to a manhunt that has now outlasted almost every other unsolved case in Victorian history. If you have any information relating to the whereabouts of Elmer Crawford, you're encouraged to contact Victoria Police or Crime Stoppers. Thank you for listening.